Shalom lekulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And welcome to this, our latest English language Zoom program. Every Wednesday, I have a guest with me virtually to talk about an issue that's pertinent to Israeli politics or the Middle East or Jewish issues, or one of the things that matter to those of us who follow Israel's fortunes. So for any newcomers, let me just explain briefly how it's going to go. I'm going to speak to our guests for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll go to questions from you guys. You can write those questions in to the chat at the bottom of your screen, and I will select some choice questions to put to our guest. Okay, today we're going to be dealing with an issue which was very recently big news, both in Israel and I think around the world for anyone who sort of cares about Israel and its image and what's being said about it. The very prominent, high-profile and influential human rights organization, Amnesty International, came out with a report in which they explicitly labeled Israel an apartheid state. They weren't the first to do this. It's previously been done by Human Rights Watch and other smaller NGOs. And clearly when something like that happens and an organization as influential, organizations as influential as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are making this accusation, an accusation which I'm pretty sure is not leveled at any other country that I'm aware of, but we can discuss that since the end of apartheid in South Africa. It requires serious pushback. It requires actual factual research, scholarly data, and to argue against it. And fortunately, we have an organization, NGO Monitor, that does that kind of work. Those of you who are regulars may recall that Gerald Steinberg, the president and founder of NGO Monitor, was on just a couple of months ago talking about the Israeli NGOs that were designated as terror organizations. And we're really fortunate to have with us from NGO Monitor, Anne Herzberg, the legal advisor of NGO Monitor and the co-author of a couple of reports which are very relevant to this topic. She is herself a graduate of Oberlin College and Columbia University Law School. Prior to joining NGO Monitor, she was an attorney in New York. Her areas of research include business and human rights, international human rights law, the laws of armed conflict, universal jurisdiction, international fact-finding, NGOs and the UN. She's the author of the widely cited NGO Lawfare, Exploitation of Courts in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and co-author of Best Practices for Human Rights and Humanitarian NGO Fact-Finding. She's had articles and op-eds published in a number of publications in Israel and the United States, including the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. And it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Anne. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
Great. So let's start. This is a really important topic, and first, actually, maybe I could ask you, and you could explain to all of us just why it is so important. Why is it that an accusation as toxic as the apartheid accusation from the likes of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International is so dangerous and so important to counter?
So I think there are two things. Number one, a year ago, the International Criminal Court, in a 2-1 decision, highly controversial decision, decided that it had jurisdiction over the, quote, situation in Palestine. The prosecutor of the criminal court, even though the Palestinian Authority is not a state, decided she wanted to go forward with investigating and potentially bringing cases against Israeli officials. So she had filed a request with the pretrial chamber of the ICC to get permission to do so. And in February of 2021, they agreed with her that she would have jurisdiction to open an investigation, which she did in March. Now, this is important because apartheid is a crime against humanity in the statute of the International Criminal Court. And unlike reports, let's say from the UN that, contribute obviously to demonization and delegitimization of Israel, when you're dealing with the International Criminal Court, it's something with teeth. Even though Israel's not a member of the court, but because of this controversial decision, now it's the man who took over as the prosecutor, he can file indictments now and try to get those approved and initiate cases against Israeli officials. Now, whether that will go to trial is highly unlikely because you'd have to arrest those officials, which is a whole other story, but the potential is there. So that is something where there's teeth. And that is one of the reasons why we have seen this increase in reporting in the past year on this topic. And then the second reason that it is dangerous is because of the impact it has in the diaspora on Jewish communities. Because these types of reports are really used to underpin the BDS movement. So when you see, for instance, Ben and Jerry's or on college campuses, academic associations approving BDS resolutions, they often reference apartheid. And when you have a group like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch that has such incredible power, incredibly influential organizations, hundreds of millions of dollars in budget, and very influential. And for most people, if they don't examine the details, have a lot of credibility. And so that's really why these reports have to be addressed, even though the charge is ridiculous on its face. But because of the situation we're in now, we can't ignore it.
And when you say, when we talk about the kind of influence that they have, as you said, they have huge influence, and they have huge budgets, right? Multi-million-dollar yes. budgets. So what can they do? What can they do with all this power? Which kinds of people or institutions are listening to them that make their influence so important in a negative sense for us, for Israel?
Right. So primarily the UN. So these two organizations and NGOs in general, but in particular, these two NGOs have tremendous influence within the UN system. They get a lot of special privileges, private meetings with UN officials. And then the other pernicious thing about it is almost all UN reporting on Israel is based on NGO claims, non-verified claims. And I call it NGO washing, could be terror washing, because they will take claims from these NGOs, put them in a report with the UN stamp, and all of a sudden then everything they say is fact because it has this UN stamp, even though the UN has done nothing to verify the accuracy of these NGO reports. Right. And unfortunately, last year, and probably a lot of the listeners are familiar, the UN Human Rights Council voted on a resolution to establish a commission of inquiry based on the conflict last May, but also in their mandate copied Human Rights Watch's apartheid reports and are also now looking at what they've termed the root causes of the conflict, which means they are going to be looking at apartheid in the conflict. And they appointed Navi Pillay, a South African, who has called Israel apartheid multiple times. She's the chair of this commission. And what this commission's doing, unlike other commissions where like the Goldstone Commission, where they published a one-off report, okay, this commission is different because it is set up, it has the biggest budget of any commission ever at the Human Rights Council, has the most staff. It has more staff than many of the divisions at the Human Rights Council combined. It has a huge staff. And what they are set up to do is, in their words, to collect evidence of crimes, which will then be transferred to the ICC. And so what is going to happen, and I will guarantee this to everyone here, when their first report comes out in June or July of this year, they will be quoting extensively from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and all of those claims are going to be going to the ICC. So that just shows like the type of influence.
Right. So when we're talking about human rights, when we're talking about alleged allegations of human rights abuses or any kind of humanitarian issue, reports from the likes of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are like Turami Sinai, right? They're like, they are taken as gospel truth, regardless, regardless of either the veracity or the professionalism of the research done, right?
Exactly.
Because as your reports, not just these particular reports, but NGO Monitor's reports over many years have shown, there's a lot of shoddy work that go and relying on eyewitness reports with no corroboration. Can you say something about the kinds of what are the reasons why, aside from the fact that as Jews and Israelis we don't like these kinds of slurs anyway, why should we be suspicious of the kinds of reports that they're putting out? What in terms of the methodology?
Sure. So I'll talk more generally and then specifically on the Israel case. So generally, Amnesty, it started out, and probably many of the people listening remember this, writing letters for political prisoners. Amnesty was founded by a Jewish man born in Jerusalem, who was a Zionist, Alex Benenson. And they would write letters for political prisoners. I remember writing such letters in high school, and probably many other people remember doing this in university. In the late 80s, early 90s, they switched their mandate. They brought in their mandate to start looking at armed conflict. But they are not experts in military affairs. They do not employ such experts. And in terms of the law, international law, they have a very clear agenda of what they want to accomplish. So when they write their reports, they are tagging their reports to an invented standard of law that they want to see adopted, but it's not the actual law. So like, for instance, in the apartheid case, they invented a definition of apartheid specifically for the Israel case. They do, yes, and they do this in many other areas, like especially in terms of fighting in Gaza, like there's standards, for when an attack is a war crime. All the time there's and it's not just in Israel. I have looked at their reporting in Amnesty and Human Rights Watch in other conflict cases, and it's the same problem. So it's not that those problems are not confined to Israel. Unfortunately, when you have Israel involved, there's a whole other layer of problems that go on top of it, because unlike other countries, now I can't say this with 100% certainty, but pretty much from what I've seen, when it comes to Israel, these NGOs deliberately appoint partisans to run their desks, their research desks for the countries. So Human Rights Watch, for instance, the guy who runs the Israel desk is a massive BDS supporter. He's been doing BDS his whole career. He was SJP, Students of Justice in Palestine, that harassed Jews all over America. And he is the head of the Israel desk. So, and this is very common. The guy who used to write the reports on Israel for Human Rights Watch had an obsession with Nazi memorabilia.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so that was about 10 years ago that got exposed. So, and the same thing with Amnesty. We see people who there was a man in England who exposed a lot of the employees at Amnesty were in these Facebook groups.
Right.
David Collier, I believe his name is.
Yes.
And so a lot of the people working there have, unfortunately, highly troubling views about Jews and anti-Semitism. And again, these are the people that are writing these reports. So it's like they, on top of their political agenda that's driving their reporting, you have then this extra layer of animosity towards Jews and Israel in particular.
Right.
And so that obviously then impacts the quality of the reporting.
And on the specifics of this apartheid allegation, because I mean, from what, as you just said, they created this definition of apartheid to fit Israel, which I think, if I remember an interview with Amnesty, they themselves admit that it's not the same as the apartheid in South Africa. So even though I mean, apartheid is an Afrikaans word, I mean,
right,
it was
right.
specific. It was specific to a period in time in a particular country, and yet they're claiming that we can still make this apartheid claim because, as you said, not only is it a loaded term, but it's actually formally a crime against humanity according to the ICC. So they can make that they can accuse Israel of this crime against humanity, even though it doesn't fit the one definition of apartheid that is historically accurate.
Exactly, and it's the only case we know of. It's the only case.
Right. So right. So now, so after we sort of get over the absurdity a little, let's get into the specifics. So you've written a couple of reports. One in response to Human Rights Watch. Is that right?
Yes. So yeah. Basically, I have a co-author, Joshua Kern, who's a barrister in the UK.
Right.
And actually, it was almost a year ago, we decided we really needed to do a comprehensive debunking of Human Rights Watch's report and the apartheid claim, because it really hadn't been done. There have been many reports from the Palestinian perspective, but there have been very, very few, maybe just one or two debunkings of the charge against Israel. And even those were not very comprehensive. And this is the issue. When we started, we were like, oh, okay, it'll take us, maybe a few weeks to write these reports. Little did we know. When you start getting into the weeds of this topic, it is very complicated, primarily because there's no one clear definition of apartheid in international law, which I can get into if people are interested in. So that took a long time to parse. And then once we were able to figure out what the definition appears to be, then we wanted to apply it to the specific case of Israel. So our first report, we were really looking at the legal standard. And then the second report, we applied to things like the law of return or concept of a Jewish state, occupation.
These are all things. These things that you mentioned, law of return, concept of Jewish state, these are things which Human Rights Watch claimed were part of the apartheid definition.
Yes. And so really we added Amnesty in because Amnesty came out when we were writing it, we realized we couldn't do it in one report. It would be like it would be a really long report. So we decided to split it up into two reports. One legal and then one on the facts. And when we were writing finishing up the factual report, the Amnesty report came out. So we added that in.
Right.
And then for the audience, I'll just mention that we also have a report coming out probably next week where we had an independent researcher who has gone through the entire Amnesty report footnote by footnote and has identified over 200 errors, misrepresentations, and omissions in the research. So when that comes out, people should take a look at it just to see, because he really got into the specifics of each thing on the Amnesty report. But what we were doing was looking more at general topics, general concepts that appear in all of these different reports.
Okay. So Anne actually linked to both reports at the beginning of this meeting. I'm just putting them in again now into the chat for those of you who weren't here at the beginning. So you can don't read them now because we want you to stay with us, but you can click on those links and open them in your browsers to view later. You can also find them on the NGO Monitor website, of course. Okay, so if I remember the Amnesty one is the more recent one, the Amnesty allegation, and it got a lot of coverage. Was there anything different, anything special about this Amnesty one which made it more problematic from our point of view and more sort of newsworthy generally?
So the difference, I would say, I can get into it if you want, like sort of the history of this NGOs looking at writing about it. So please. That might be helpful. Yeah. Just a brief history, because then it'll set up the two reports. Brief history. The Arab states started making this charge in the late 50s, early 60s, primarily at the UN. Israel and the Soviet relations break down around that time. The Soviets have this massive propaganda apparatus, which they employ to discredit Zionism. So they start and their apparatus, their propaganda apparatus, is very active in the third world, in Africa, in the Arab world. So they employ these propaganda outlets to start disseminating the claim that Zionism is racism and apartheid, a more virulent form of racism. So this starts showing up in resolutions. And then we saw in 1975, the Zionism is racism resolution at the UN.
Yeah.
That gets repealed in 1991. We have the peace process. So this topic kind of dies down a little bit. It's revived again at the Durban Conference in 2001, the UN Durban Conference, where originally in the official documents for the conference, which were negotiated in Tehran, where Jews and Israelis were not allowed to attend, basically branded Israel Israel's brand of apartheid. Okay, it was in this state document that got migrated into the NGO forum document. And
this is the World Conference Against Racism, right?
Exactly. And in the NGO declaration, it talks about Israel's brand of apartheid as a crime against humanity. And because of this, we have to start employing a South Africa strategy to Israel. We need total boycott economically, diplomatically, culturally against Israel. It started the BDS movement and also establish a international criminal tribunal to go after Israel's crimes, which was apartheid. So this was in 2001. So fast forward to 2007, there's a UN rapporteur named John Dugard, who was South African, and he was very keyed in with all these NGOs who were active at Durban. He starts using his platform at the UN to start pushing for a legal examination of apartheid. 2009, a group of NGOs, some Israelis, Palestinian NGOs, and a couple international NGOs put out a report, which was very influential, a couple 100-page report that is mainly through Palestinian NGOs, but also in the BDS movement was very popular, this report. Okay, so then we get to 2021, and basically HRW's report is pretty much a copy of this 2009 report. It's very similar. So HRW's report, they claim that it's definitely apartheid in the territories, they would say, but within the green line, it may be apartheid. But they for sure it is, in the West Bank and Gaza, but it's not necessarily it may be. But in order to prove that it is apartheid in the territories, they look at the foundational policies of Israel as a Jewish state, Israel's existence as a Jewish state, the law of return, primarily those policies, to bolster their claim there's apartheid. Amnesty comes along. So they're basically saying there is this regime, and they use the term Jewish supremacy. That's what they call it. But Salem also does this a few months before. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. So those words should evoke the audience. And then Amnesty's report comes along, and so the Palestinian NGOs at this time are much more radical. The Palestinian NGOs are saying Zionism is settler colonialism, and the only remedy to that is elimination.
Yeah.
So HRW doesn't go quite as far, even though they are in alignment with they're just smarter about it. They definitely believe that, but they just have better PR and they're better on their messaging. Really, that's all it comes down to. Fast forward to Amnesty. Amnesty overtly adopts the radical Palestinian position. So Amnesty is like, no, the whole thing is apartheid. Yeah. Israel's been an apartheid regime since 1948. And so that was really what was different about Amnesty. And then they tried to that was in the embargoed version of the report. And then when the report was formally published, they took out the main line where they said that, although it's still in there in a couple other places. Because they already were getting tons of criticism about it because everyone saw the embargoed report. So they've been trying to walk it back. But then just a couple of weeks ago, the head of Amnesty USA said, we don't believe a Jewish state should exist. So,
didn't he also say that he doesn't believe that American Jews really want to say that the survey data revealing American Jewish connection to Israel actually isn't right, and what his gut tells him is, of course, the truth about American Jews.
Exactly.
Okay. So, all right. So this is kind of where we are. I mean, I guess just a quick before I go to we've had a number of questions already. But I mean, is there something? Do you think that obviously NGO Monitor does great work? Is there an official Israeli government response to this kind of thing that's useful, that's helpful, that isn't counterproductive? Something that they did do, or something you think they should have done but didn't do?
Yeah. So Israel, of course, rejects the charge as being absurd, but I think the government has been walking. I think I haven't discussed this with them, so I'm just sort of
it's your opinion,
informed speculation, I'll say. But I think they are walking a line where they don't want to directly respond to the charges because they don't want to give it credence. And I understand that because it is, and there was a few months ago, there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed sort of along those lines. I forget who wrote it, but basically like Israel should not play this game. Like we should not be playing the game. And while I agree with that at one level, because of where things have taken us now with the ICC and with these BDS campaigns, you do have to respond. Now, I do think, I don't think we need to get like so into the details. I think staying in the macro level is sufficient because what's so, I think, pernicious about these reports, they're hundreds of pages long. And this was the problem we had really when we were writing our response, our two reports. It's very easy to level a claim, like Israel stole all the land. Okay, so they can say it's apartheid because Israel stole all Palestinian land. And that's all they have to say. But in order to refute that charge, it takes a long time. You have to explain it, unpack the charge, and then refute it, which takes a lot of time. And it probably could have taken us thousands of pages to really respond to each, exactly. Right. Every policy, case, official quote, they're like taking everything and putting it in this mishmash of this huge, grand conspiracy theory of apartheid throughout the entire history of the conflict. And so to really like unpack it and debunk it, already we've written 200 pages. We're putting out this Amnesty other report that's 100 pages. So it's really takes a long time. So I understand why they have not come out with anything really official.
Right. I suppose it goes back to what you just said about how they can make these claims and don't really have to they don't have to substantiate them. And I think I guess it goes back to what we said before about they've built up these reputations of being these not just credible but unimpeachable sources of truth and goodness, and therefore just by having Amnesty International says that Israel's taken the land, it's almost like they don't need to back it up because they just assume that people they're right. They rightly assume that people are just going to take it as the truth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, another thing they do also, a main underpinning of their claim is that the Palestinian people are fragmented, Israel deliberately fragmented the Palestinian people from its inception. And this is how they established the apartheid, the regime of domination, Jewish domination. Meanwhile, what don't they tell you? Why is the Palestinian population fragmented? There was a war. Gaza was controlled by Egypt, and the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. And there's a refugee issue that the Arab states at the time in 1949 refused to do a settlement agreement, which was in the works. So, but they claim, so they omit all of that history, and it's like, oh, from day one, that was Israel's plan. It's like, I don't think that was Israel's plan to be invaded, so it's that kind of thing, that they do. And to people who don't know that, people today, they don't know the history. So it sounds good when you just hear they fragment the people and they're Palestinians and these different.
Yeah, there are a lot of sort of lies that can be told by just not telling them, by just not mentioning.
Exactly. Right? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's get some questions. We've got a bunch already. So Charles Kirschbaum asks if you have a comment on Harvard Law School's report. I'm not sure what that's. Can you tell us what he's referring to? Because I don't know, and maybe other people don't know.
I do know what he's referring to.
Thanks,
so, Harvard Human Rights Clinic, and again, people should just keep in mind these clinics are run by activists. There's little oversight from the administration. These people, I went to Columbia Law School, so I know how this stuff works. They do what they want. And if you get someone who's very radical, and which unfortunately is the case right now in a lot of law schools, particularly in the United States, they do these things. But basically, Harvard Human Rights Law Clinic partnered with a Palestinian NGO known as Adamir, which is one of the 6 NGOs that was designated. Adamir is the PFLP's prisoner rights organization. So what do? They serve as lawyers for PFLP people, and they do propaganda for PFLP prisoners, terrorists. And that's who they are. And there's no question they don't deny they are part of the PFLP. They do not deny that. So Harvard, strangely, well, again, because it's these people who are unaccountable, and I don't understand it. Harvard actually could be facing a lot of legal risk.
Wow.
Because the PFLP is a designated terrorist organization in the United States.
Right. This is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Right.
Yes. Yeah. And so they have now partnered with a terror group, terror affiliates and a terror group, according to Israel, in their designation. So they are looking at some legal liability. But anyway, what happened is what I think happened is actually probably Adamir either approached them, because what they did a submission to the Commission of Inquiry at the Human Rights Council on apartheid. It's the same nonsense from the other reports. It's nothing new. But what I think was being done here was terror washing, in my opinion, because if Adamir alone had submitted that, well, you say, yeah, they're PFLP. So of course they're going to say that stuff. I'm not taking the word of a terrorist group at face value. So they get Harvard to join on. Oh, but it's Harvard, the best law school in America. Wow. So that's really, in my opinion, that is terror washing. It's like what the UN does. It's putting a stamp of a more credible institution to basically launder the claims. It's terror laundering, terror claim laundering, to launder the claims of a terrorist affiliate.
Yeah.
That's what they've done. We're actually going to be publishing a rebuttal of that report in the next few weeks also.
Right.
So,
great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Charles. Thank you for asking that question. We got a great response to that. Okay. So there's a good sort of quite fundamental question here from Rachel Efrati, who asks, why or how did Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch get so much power and influence?
So it's a good question. They have a lot of money. That's a lot of it. I think, you really just have to look at the history of the human rights movement, sort of how, like at the UN, for instance, in 1993, they established the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And that office now employs several thousand people. And the function of this office essentially is writing reports. What is the real function of the Human Rights Council, aside from giving dictators, space to say what they want? Yes. They pass resolutions calling on this office to write reports. That's their basic, claim to being. And so they need material to write these reports. And so NGOs are very, that's what they do.
And you mentioned when you were talking about Amnesty and its formation by a Zionist Jew, it was at the time it was about prisoners of conscience. Was it in the communist world? Was it a part of the Cold War? Was that
no?
Was that the context?
With Amnesty, I for sure was the context with Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch, right. That's what I'm thinking of.
Amnesty, I believe it was, but I'm not 100% sure.
Right. Because I think that's also part of. I think that's also part of the kind of the development of their reputation and their power. That in the context of this titanic struggle between East and West, then they're these NGOs who are very much on the right side of history against the oppressive communist regime, and then Cold War ends and they have to find something else to do.
Exactly. And also just at that time, in the 90s, there was a real shift to international institutions. You had the EU getting much bigger. You had a lot of these human rights mechanisms being developed in all of these different institutions: OECD, OSCE, EU, the United States State Department, human rights reports. There were all these institutions being built. And so they needed to have this kind of outside input. And then the EU also really highly values what it calls civil society, and was starting to give, billions of dollars to these organizations. And so that's really how their influence built up.
Right. Okay, thank you. So question here from Stephen Nadler. Are there any Israeli or Jewish organizations taking the initiative and charging the ICC, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the UN Human Rights Council of anti-Semitism?
So there's a lot of groups that say that, I think these reports are anti-Semitic. In terms of the ICC, it'd be hard to make a case, I think, for that based on the statute.
Right.
And especially against those actors. And then when you're talking about the UN, there's no accountability. So the UN there's no mechanism. You could complain about the UN, but the UN itself has no accountability measures. And unfortunately, what we've seen is, especially among European countries that are some of the biggest funders of the Human Rights Council, they don't hold them accountable. So it would have to be through money that, so groups like ours, we can talk about that, how they are promoting anti-Semitism. But really, the way to really get it to stop would be governments who give money to these institutions would have to say, unless we're not going to give you any more money unless you stop this.
What about just to sort of take Stephen's point? What about with the NGOs, with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty? Is there any scope for actual sort of charging them on some grounds of anti-Semitism
there's no real, unless they were somehow, how you have the Palestinian incitement against Jews. So Palestinian officials certainly could be investigated. I think it would be hard you'd have to make a case where let's say some Human Rights Watch official was actively working in concert with a Palestinian official to craft, it's a hard case under the ICC statute.
Right. Okay.
But
great. Thank you.
Rwanda, but I'll just say in Rwanda, there was the case involving the radio station that was putting out a lot of incitement. So you might be able to look at precedents like that.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Isabel Margolin has a question about about whether your results, the results of your reports, have been disseminated in any major publications. Have you been asked to share a summary of your report by any news agencies? Are you getting coverage of these reports?
So it's interesting. So our report has been covered a lot both reports were covered a lot in the Jewish press and in Israeli media, Jerusalem Post, Makor Rishon. So it's gotten a lot of coverage there. But it just shows you really the mainstream media does not. So like every mainstream media outlet covered the HRW and Amnesty reports because they have an instant in with the media, with the mainstream media, but they don't want to cover the counter arguments, and I think that's highly problematic. But that's unfortunately the media environment we're in.
Yeah.
So we do these podcasts or, these webinars are great, to get the information out.
Right. No, for sure. It's okay. I'm happy to be of service in that regard, for sure. Okay. So this is not a question, but a comment that I think we can all agree with from Simon Hazelton, who just says this is the 21st century equivalent of the blood libels, of medieval blood libels. Invent a lie, repeat it often enough, and it becomes the truth. And I think
I think that's true. Yeah.
That's what we're dealing with. Okay, David Rees has a question. He says, I understand that Amnesty says that Israel's actions do not constitute apartheid as it was practiced in South Africa, but is according to the definition which is accepted by international law. Is that what Amnesty says? That's his understanding.
So that's what Amnesty says, but they are wrong. Because they have made up a definition that is not basically, and I'll just say there's a few treaties that talk about apartheid, and they kind of cobbled it all together into a Franken definition.
Right. So, right. Because there isn't, as you said, there isn't one standard definition. Right.
And so, well,
there's legal definition, I should stress.
So like the ICC statute has a definition of apartheid, the Rome statute, but again, it's and we analyzed that in our report because of the ICC case. Even though Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute and is not bound by this definition, but the thing that when you actually look at the words of the definition, what makes it tricky is it uses very vague words. It uses words like oppression, domination. And so what does that mean? What does the word domination mean? So most of the commentators actually, until our report and one other report, no, actually in the other report also, basically we're one of the only reports looking at this, the only analysis that actually looked at what domination means in a legal sense. The other people
just legal definition of domination.
Well, we had to figure it out because everyone else was going to the dictionary and just looking up the word domination, but that's not sufficient. To do a legal definition necessarily.
Right.
So that's what makes it tricky because it uses words that are not clear and the formulation is very weird. So it's not, when you read that definition, it's not evident what it means. And that's the problem because it's very vague. It's very easy for groups like Amnesty to come in and make something up.
So David, who asked that question, has a follow-up question, which is relevant here. He says that the reports are written in English, and he says Webster's, Oxford, and Cambridge dictionaries all define apartheid as related to South Africa. Since only lawyers care about what international lawyers claim about the legal definition, isn't what it means in English much more important, particularly in the political sphere?
Well, it is a very good point because if they're going to the dictionary to look at the term domination, they should be going to the dictionary to look up apartheid, which says South Africa, which is a very good point. Yeah.
Fair enough. So, okay, there's
it's
a question
here. It's a political term. I mean, I just want to say, I mean, it is a legal term, but it also has a political sense, and it has resonance, and that's why it's being used.
Of course.
It's because occupation doesn't have the same resonance anymore that apartheid does. And that's precisely why they're using it. And they admit it openly. Like I've seen strategy documents from various conferences. They openly say we're switching. They openly say this in a 2013 conference that happened at Birzeit University in Ramallah, which was with a bunch of UN officials, the PA, many NGOs, and some academics. They say it explicitly. We are moving from an occupation paradigm to an apartheid paradigm because it resonates more with the public. That's a verbatim line from this document.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Very, very revealing. So we have a question here from Bull Dwang, who says, he asked if Amnesty have any comment or stance on the multi-generation refugee status of only Palestinians and why these refugee camps have never been dismantled, as have all other refugee camps.
Yeah, they don't talk about that. Yeah.
Right. Do they talk about, do they get into any sort of Palestinian issues? I mean, do they get into, because I think, I mean, and I want to make sure I'm being fair. I think I'm right in saying that they have criticized Hamas, for example, for targeting Israeli civilians. Is that right?
They do not in this report, though. I mean, it's very like their whole summary of the suicide bombing campaign of the 2000s is in like 5 words or 1 sentence. Bombs were placed in crowded locations. That's it. That's their description of the entire,
Second
or some rocket, right. Or in May, some rockets were fired.
Right.
Right. So it's completely glossed over and minimized. In the past, they've maybe had a couple of reports, but when you compare it to what they've put out on Israel, it doesn't compare. And then also, even in those reports, let's say where they talk about Hamas, they still mostly talk about Israel. Like they still blame Israel for Hamas,
right?
Right. So it's very, I find it dishonest because they completely erase that history. And also that a lot of the policies they're criticizing as apartheid were necessitated by these suicide bombings and other acts. So you can't divorce that from the context.
Of course, of course.
Yeah, of course. But that's what they do.
Right. Just out of interest, what's their take on the separation barrier? Because I know at one time, back in the day when I was involved in these things, it was called the apartheid wall.
Right. We still consider it that.
Still called that?
Yeah.
Okay. You're fair. Plus ça change. Okay. Okay. So a question from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who wants to know. He asks about what according to you are the real dimensions of the damage done by a true leftist movement creating radical anti-Israeli groups that are trying to see similarity between Israel and apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I find a shame about the Israeli groups like B'Tselem, let's say, or Yesh Din. And I just want to say, I do think it's important for all societies to have human rights groups that are monitoring and holding the government accountable. I do think that's important.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, B'Tselem and Yesh Din have taken it too far, and I don't know if they just don't understand. First of all, they want Israel to be punished because they think the conflict is all our fault and we are 100% responsible for what has been going on. And they want the international community to punish us. And they think the only way things are going to change in their view is if we are forced to do what they want, and also they're quite unclear what they want. So I don't know. Do they want a one state by now? I don't know what they want. They don't tell you. And I think that's deliberate that they don't tell you. But the other thing that I find sad, and I don't know if they even understand what they're doing. And one of the things we wanted to do in our report, Josh and I, was to show the rhetoric they're using is coming from Soviet rhetoric and from Arab eliminationist rhetoric. You know, the origins of this are Arab eliminationism and Soviet propaganda. And this is the rhetoric that they're adopting in their reports. And some of it's even neo-Nazi. Like when you're talking about Jewish supremacy, I mean, it's really, even a Nazi term. You know, you look about in the 30s, they were using these types of terms: Jewish domination, Jewish supremacy.
Right. Yeah, you see it in like kind of what in like sort of Ku Klux Klan type stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. David Duke says it all the time. Right, head of the KKK in America, and they're using this language, and I don't know if they understand that that's what they're doing. So if I was ever given the opportunity, I don't think they would talk to me about this. Unfortunately, they don't seem interested in having dialogue with Israelis anymore. Unfortunately, they seem to have shunned us. But they, that's the kind of thing I would want to ask them. Why do you think it's helpful to adopt this type of rhetoric? How is that going to bring you closer to your goal?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Another question from Bull, who's asked a previous question. He says, does Amnesty make any comments about other separation walls, such as in Belfast or other places? And maybe if I could just add on to that, you mentioned that they've only leveled the apartheid accusation at Israel. Are there other, how are Amnesty and Human Rights Watch dealing with other other countries where there's a question of occupation, or other countries where there's an internal conflict going on? I'm thinking of, Pakistan and India with Kashmir, or China with Tibet. Like what's being said, what's being done there as well?
Yeah, so I'll just say for the wall in Belfast, generally the human rights movement calls it the peace wall. So I think that tells you everything. But
absolutely. What did they do? What did they do to get it to be called a peace wall? Maybe we just need better graffiti. I don't know.
Right. So I don't know if Amnesty calls it the peace wall, but I see it in a lot of human rights reporting called the peace wall.
Very nice. Very nice.
But so there's one other situation where Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have called the situation apartheid, and that was in Myanmar a few years ago. They said this, but there's a clear difference. Because when you look at Myanmar, what they wrote about Myanmar, the definition that they're using in that case is much closer to the definition that we, from our writing, Josh and I's reports, we think that the actual definition in international law is. They didn't make up a fake definition for Myanmar. So that's really the clear difference there.
How interesting. So that definition could not apply to Israel, because I assume we're talking about the sort of mass killing and expulsion of the Rohingya Muslims.
Right. And also just like putting them in camps, camps.
Right.
Stuff that's not happening here.
Indeed.
And the other thing is, you don't see the same type of campaign with Myanmar so within a week, I think, or maybe less even, of Amnesty's report coming out, they now have an online class, learn about Israel and apartheid in our online class. I don't remember them doing one for Myanmar. I looked, I couldn't find it. I don't know if they did, but it's certainly not available right now, as far as I could tell.
And where's the UN Human Rights Commission into
exactly.
Myanmar?
So that's the difference. It doesn't have the same impact as it does on Israel. But the other interesting thing was when in the Times of Israel, is Lazar Berman.
Lazar Berman's interview.
Yeah. So he did an interview with two of the senior officials at Amnesty when the report came out. And he really did a service to all of us. Great
job, yeah.
Because he pushed them on this issue. He said, because they claim, we decided in 2017, we're going to look at the issue of apartheid globally. And so he was like, so you started doing this in 2017, and the only case you could come up with in addition was Israel? And you supposedly have been systematically examining. And And of course, they couldn't answer the question because he totally exposed them. And then he was saying, well, what about China and the Uyghurs? And they were trying to weasel out of it, you know. So it's very clear they have not been looking at this issue globally, and they've not been taking a systematic examination.
It reminds me
not be hearing about it anywhere else, you know.
It reminds me of something Einat Wilf said, that when people tell her that they're not just anti-Zionist, they're against all. They're like sort of left-wing anti-Zionists. They're against all national. They're against all national movements. It says, but for some reason, they all want to start with Israel first.
Right. Exactly.
They're against them all, but they all want to start with Israel.
Right, and also their solution is replacing Israel with a Palestinian,
national, right? Indeed,
an Arab ethno-national state with domination over Jews. So that's okay. Indeed. They have no problem with Arab supremacy, but you know, indeed.
It's a strange world we live in. So we're running out of time. Let me just ask you one quick question before we go, because I know that NGO Monitor does a lot of work into the funding of NGOs and of anti-Israel and anti-Zionist sort of activities by NGOs. Do you get what sort of response do you get from foreign governments that fund these kinds of reports? I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the types of reports done by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, which your own research has found to be, you know, massively biased and you know, done with a clear, you know, preconceived agenda. I mean, when that can be so conclusively proven, is that something you can take to the funders? And I'm interested to know what response you'd get.
So I'll say two things. Firstly, when it comes to Amnesty and HRW, you're dealing mostly with private funders. So it's much harder with them. And HRW, well, I'll say HRW is a bit more transparent on its donors. You can sometimes find who the donors are. Sometimes they used to post them on their website. They don't anymore. You can write to them and request a list of the donors. But I know if I wrote to them, I probably wouldn't get it. So, and really in response to our work was when they started taking the donors off their website. But so, you know, so there it's a lot of private individuals and foundations. Amnesty is even more of a black hole. They have all of these, they have like 3, I believe, entities in the UK. I've not seen a list of their donors. It's very hard to get. They claim they're funded by members, but their budget appears to be too big to be coming from, you know, mom and pop. And, you know, they're clearly getting foundational money, but it's hard to know. Amnesty US got a huge infusion of cash in the past couple of years. No idea where the money's coming from. So that makes it hard. Now, when you're dealing with Palestinian NGOs or even groups, let's say like B'Tselem, so they get a majority of their money, if not all. I don't know for B'Tselem what their breakdown is, but certainly the Palestinian NGOs, it's almost all funded from European governments in the EU, their money, so, and foundations, but mostly from governments. And all of the Western governments have opposed this report, like except maybe Ireland. None of the Western European governments have come out in favor of this report. And they've even explicitly said, we don't agree with these reports, but they are funding these reports.
Right.
And they will deny it till the, the cows come home, as we say in America. But they will deny it, and that they don't fund this type of thing, but they're explicitly funding these types of reports.
Yeah.
So that to me is a huge disconnect. Like, how can you say you do not agree with the premise, but yet you're giving millions of dollars to groups that are making that premise?
Right.
So it's quite strange. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's obviously a lot of there's still a lot of work for you and your colleagues to be doing. But we really appreciate you coming on, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing, because it's so important to be countering this kind of toxic sort of slurs and defamations against Israel and the Jewish people, and we thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience for joining us. I've written in my email address, paulg@begincentre.org.il, for those of you who are not on my mailing list and would like to be, and you'll get information of all the English stuff that we do both on Zoom and in person. So that's it. I'll be back next week with another of these. You'll see information either from my email if you're on the mailing list, or on our website or Facebook group if not. And thanks again to Anne Herzberg. Bye.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye. Bye.